Good evening, everyone. Okay, sorry, please just give me a minute. Okay, I'll start now. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to everyone here for participating in tonight's webinar. This is the first of 4 webinars that we're going to be having as the book Stokvel in commemoration of Charlotte Maxeke. Before we get started, I would just like to introduce myself and just give a brief background on the webinar and why the book Stokvel decided to host them. So the book Stokvel is a collective of readers and writers, and we operate as a Stokvel in the most traditional sense, as it's known in Black communities. So the book Stokvel is a collective of people that come together monthly and contribute money towards buying owned bookstores or from Black vendors. And the reason the book Stokvel came together was because there was a need. There was a need that was identified, which sort of heightened as well during the Fees Must Fall era for support of works by Black people, and in many ways, as well as wanting as well to not necessarily take charge, but participate and be a stakeholder in the value chain of publishing or telling of Black stories, you know, and the economic benefits of it then become secondary. So that's why then the book Stokvel was founded, or that's how then the book Stokvel was founded. So we started in April of 2018, and this is our 3rd year. We started, I think it was about 8 members. We are now sitting at about 300, and this year we also had to start a similar initiative for kids, because parents indicated that they were having challenges with finding appropriate and content appropriate and age appropriate books for their kids. So that's when then we also started the Kids Stokvel. So some of the things that we also do as the book Stokvel, because storytelling isn't only through books, we also try to have engagements or discussions about people and also about things that are happening. We try to stay away from talking about what would be considered things that constantly demand of Black people to prove their humanity, you know. The conversation is already being had about those things. So we, in as much as it's very important to have the conversations, but we don't want our existence to solely be about constantly talking about Black experiences that are characterized by pain, etc., etc., etc. We want to talk about flimsy things, because that's also who we are as human beings. We want to talk about things that we consider petty, things that are considered unimportant, and all those things. But sometimes it also is important to have important conversations. So that's how then also we came to decide that we need to have something in commemoration of Charlotte Maxeke for a whole lot of reasons. One of them being the fact that women's contribution in the liberation of this country has been erased for the longest time, where most times when you would read texts about the history of this country, and perhaps texts predating the 80s, women were only depicted as people that played like an auxiliary role of sorts. You know, they are not people that were recognized as leaders, as intellectuals, as theorists in their own right. So often a woman, when it's written about or spoken about in history, would always be in reference to the men that are in their lives, or the men that were in their lives at the time. And with Charlotte Maxeke, although a bit different, but there seems to be inconsistencies or perhaps distorted known truths. I don't know if I should put it that way about her, because you can ask different groups of people about who Charlotte Maxeke is, and sometimes people don't know, or they can just say, in the education space, for example, people will tell you that she's the first woman to get a degree in South Africa. And other people in the religious space will tell you about the African Methodist the AME Church rather. So and often when that conversation is heard, it's as though they're refusing to recognize Charlotte as a whole human being, you know, as a person that was participating in so many things during her time as a political activist, things that actually informed the wholeness of people's or African lives at the time. So there's though, or that's the feeling that we got as the book Stokvel, that there seems to be a thing of wanting to box her into one identity. And this is also in how we also chose the image that we'd use for the webinars, because the most images that have been going around about Charlotte Maxeke is when she was still young. And we believe that sort of like plays into the gaze of some sort of, I don't know if I should call it desirability, but it doesn't also reflect about, it doesn't fully appreciate and reflect her life when we are just also going to aesthetically, you know, lock her up in one moment of her life. So she needs to be a person that we know when she was younger, what she looked like when she was younger, and also a person that what she looked like as she grew older, because that we then get to appreciate like her whole life. So then the series for the book Stokvel was that we are not going to be a people or a collective that is going to speak about Charlotte Maxeke and only focus on one area of her life, or only maybe speak about her once off. So that's when then we decided that we are just going to have a series where we speak about all the different themes about her life. And this is the first one. She's a person that when presented with the opportunity, she pursued education, and she also opened up opportunities for people that came after her. And even when she came back returned from the States with a degree with her husband, she opened a number of educational institutions because she believed in education as a tool that would enable social change for Africans at the time. So that's the reason when we decided that we would have a webinar. One of the webinars would speak on education. And it's also not only formal education, but education in many aspects, which informs the type of panelists that we have for today. So without further ado, and also without taking much more time, because we started about 5 minutes late, and I apologize for that, I would like to hand over to Nobungcwele Mbem, who is our facilitator for tonight. And thank you once again for everyone, or to everyone rather, for participating in tonight's webinar. And thank you as well greatly to our speakers for availing themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nobungcwele Mbem, and I will be facilitating today's panel discussion titled Advancing Social Change Through Education. And all of our panelists will be sharing different insights on answering the question, how can social change be affected through formal and informal educational methods? So how we are going to structure the program is that each panelist, we've got 2, 4, 6, 7 panelists who are going to be sharing their insights and their contributions towards answering the question. And there will be 2 rounds. The first round is going to be 5 minutes, whereas each panelist is going to give us a presentation, and then we will be having a second round post that, and then we will open it up for questions and answers. As the presenters are obviously sharing their insights, you are more than welcome to use the chat box to drop your questions there so that we can be able to engage, or you can be able to engage the panelists. Without taking too much time, our first speaker, or first panelist, is Phoebe Potrita, and I'm just going to quickly read her biography. So Phoebe Potrita is a general manager of the African National Congress, a position she has held since 2018. She has been involved in political education in the Youth League and the ANC for many years, and is a board member of the OR Tambo School of Leadership. She was active in the student and youth movement during the 1980s, elected on the NEC of Azaso, now known as SASCO, the NEC of the South African Youth Congress, and the ANC Youth League NEC in different capacity, including as the first female secretary general of the ANC Youth League between the period 1996 to 1998. She also served on the National Executive Committee of the ANC from 2007 till 2012. Keda Phoebe is a founding member of the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, known as MISTRA, was a member of the Cities Alliance think tank, served on the board and advisory panel of the Education Training Unit, on the boards of the State Information Technology Agency, the Lijwele Pudzwa Development Agency, the SABC, and on the council of the Mangosuthu Buthelezi University of Technology. She's also served as a South African ambassador to Poland and as a deputy chief of staff of the South African Union Commission based in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. During her tenure in Warsaw, Poland, she co-founded the African Film Festival, which has abbreviations. Phoebe has a master's in management from the University of the Witwatersrand with her research on youth labor market policy and unemployment. Youth development and empowerment is one of her abiding interests, and she wrote the 2009 HSRC State of the Youth Reports. Phoebe is a co-owner of Kaloza Books, which publishes Pan-African children and young adult books, an avid reader and book collector. She also does the weekly book review and crossword puzzle for ANC Today, and she was born in Humansdorp, Eastern Cape. So there is a lot of obviously reflections and a lot to learn from someone who has been so active. And I'd like to hand over to you, Phoebe, to please, yes, your 5 minutes starts now.
Thank you very much. And what I want to do is to talk about 4 aspects of Charlotte Maxeke in the field of education. I think that Sarah has very eloquently spoke about the question about writing women into history. And I think that Charlotte Maxeke is an example of how women are excluded from history. We're celebrating 150 years this year since her birth. And I'm wondering what happened in 1971 when she turned 100 years old. I suppose we had the excuse that it was still under apartheid, so we couldn't celebrate the centenary of her birth. But the second issue is also that Sarah spoke about the extent to which we often tend to look at women in very one-dimensional ways. And in Beauty of the Heart, the foreword, Professor Jonathan Jansen described her in the following ways, and a clear break from this one-dimensional way in which women is regarded. And I quote, "A teacher, a social worker and an activist, a church figure, and yet respectful of African traditions, a woman of the Batlokwa who marries a Xhosa lover, a woman often alone in a man's century. And Africanist who builds race relations with European women, as whites were then called, a highly educated person with an international degree who is completely at ease amongst the poor, a healer and a fighter, one who mingles with royalty, but returns to uplift the African peasantry." End of quote. And I think that this series of seminars and other initiatives that we're doing during this year is an important way of looking at focusing on different aspects of this very rich life. Now, with regards to her contribution to education, in Beauty of the Heart, there's a very illuminating quote and conversation that happened with her father and her sister Katie, and a father who converted to Christianity about religion and colonialism. And this was in the context of King Setshwayo being banished as a prisoner from Zululand to the Cape Province by the then monarch for leading the resistance against colonialism. And on page 24, the conversation went like this, and I quote, "He was finding it difficult to reconcile the fact that Europeans practiced Christianity, but also practiced evil. So Charlotte piped up and replied, 'Those Europeans who are wicked are the messengers of Satan, sent to confuse us. But how can you tell which of the white people are really Christians and which are Satan's messengers?' Asked her sister Katie," and Katie was of course younger than Charlotte. "By prayer," said her mother, but Charlotte very interestingly replied, "By study." End of quote. And this story is an example of how from the onset and from quite a young age, she realized the importance of education and study, whether it's formal or informal. There's another story in Beauty of the Heart on the same page where the author talks about how her father, who couldn't read, had to deliver figs to a shopkeeper, and on the way he got hungry and he ate 10 of the figs. But what he didn't realize, because he was illiterate, is that the farmer wrote down the exact number of the figs that he was supposed to deliver. And when he delivered the figs to the shopkeeper knew exactly that there were 10 figs missing. And her sister Katie was fairly amused by the story about what happened to their dad. But this inspired Charlotte, and in the book she's quoted as saying, "Someday we'll go to teach them." And she was talking about her father's people in the Ramagopa village in the northern Transvaal. "I'll go to England to study what the white people are taught. Then I'll come back to teach our people," end of quote. And of course she did come back and founded a school in the village of Ramagopa. So from the onset, from a very young age, these stories just illuminate the fact that she valued education. She understood the importance of education as a means for emancipation, as well as a means for social change. The next important part of her contribution in life is the fact that she founded education institutions. The early generations of Black South Africans at the time formed newspapers, they formed publishing companies, but they also formed, and that was the middle class, they also formed schools. For example, the Maxeke family, her and her husband, formed the Wilberforce Institute in the Northern Transvaal then, but also in Everton. There's the Oshlange, formed by the Dubes in Natal. And many of these institutions were also established by the churches. And in the thesis by Kumalo, completed in 2018, he quoted one of the AME church leaders that was talking about these institutions, Black institutions and schools formed by the church. And the church leader, Mabote, was quoted as saying that in my district of Pretoria and Zoutpansberg, there are 13 schools that were founded by the church. In Tansi's district, that's in Johannesburg, there are about 6. And at Potchefstroom, there are 2. And this was just one church leader talking about the schools that they founded. The Wilberforce Industrial Institute in the then Northern Transvaal was established by the Maxekes on land provided by Batloka in 1904. And the institute was registered to teach industrial education and to train teachers. But a very interesting development here was that one of the inspectors, white inspectors that came to the institute and looked at his curriculum and what he taught, observed, and he said, "This school is sometimes advertised as Wilberforce Industrial School, but no industrial instruction is given except in needlework to girls. Maxeke is anxious that this school be recognized as a training institute for native teachers, yet from the advertisement from IMVO, it is evident that the objective is to provide for higher education." And part of the context in 1904 was that mission education that were formed and schools that were formed by Black people were seen as mainly focusing on industrial education or training teachers, but the Maxekes had a broader vision that they wanted to start providing higher education. The final issue is her position as an intellectual. And in the thesis of Dr. Tozama, April of 2012, she talks about the fact that she's known in South African history as a mother of the liberation struggle, but not necessarily as an intellectual, a theorist, a feminist, or a nationalist. And she then, throughout her thesis, then explained how her thoughts, her contributions were in fact intellectual contributions on issues of citizenship, on the issues of women's positions, on labor rights, on issues of the native questions. So not merely as the mother of the liberation struggle, but also as an intellectual in her own right. Let me conclude by saying that Charlotte Maxeke, her inspiration informed the ideas of education today, the question about education as a tool of emancipation, the importance of girls' education, the importance of mentorship, the importance of intersectionality, and the importance of education and social change. And I think that this is why 150 years later, she continued to be an inspiration in the struggle for education. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I know that 5 minutes is definitely not enough time to cover contributions, particularly of such a formidable individual. So we will just pause the questions for after every panelist has presented, and we will come back to you. So our next speaker is Zamanzima Magena, who is a senior researcher in the Knowledge Economy and Scientific Advancement faculty at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. She holds a BSc degree in biochemistry and cell biology and a BSc honors in pharmacology from Wits University. She obtained her MSc in pharmaceutics cum laude, and Zamanzima has authored journal articles on nano-enabled drug delivery technologies and the fourth industrial revolution, and has a pending patent filed with Wits Enterprise for a nano-enabled drug delivery system. She is the editor and contributing author to various MISTRA books, including on epidemics in Africa. She is a member of the Gauteng Premier's COVID-19 Advisory Committee and is currently pursuing a PhD in Innovation Studies at Wits Business School. Her research interests include healthcare systems in Africa, the implications of a fourth industrial revolution in Africa, nanomedicine, systems of innovation, the low carbon economy, and the beneficiation of strategic minerals in South Africa, particularly platinum group metals. So Zamanzima, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. So a lot has been said already about Charlotte Maxeke. And so I've been asked to talk specifically about one of the tools that are needed in order to see social change through education. So I'll be talking through issues regarding the effective use of ICT tools and networks in increasing social inclusion. So even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, debates about the fourth industrial revolution and education, particularly online education, were already well developed. And COVID-19 has created a greater need and sense of urgency as schools, universities, and other sites of education have undertaken a sudden and large-scale shift towards online learning. Educational institutions have rapidly established online learning systems that make it possible to continue education despite the closure of physical sites. This situation brings into stark relief the great flexibility and potential of online learning. It also highlights that structured and formalized online learning could lead to improved education outcomes, particularly in times of crisis. The notion of education as being place-bound is shifting to one of education taking place through a mixture of physical and digital interaction. As the convergence of physical and digital worlds becomes more deeply entrenched in our social world, it becomes more important that learners be able to navigate interactive teaching platforms and online knowledge resources. Policy measures to support these skills are critical, including the development of online standards, tools, content, and curriculum. However, we all know that digital inequality is a real thing. It renders large numbers of South Africans unable to enjoy the economic and social benefits of the internet. And this problem became more urgent with the onset of COVID-19. The unequal education landscape in South Africa, in which the private schooling system already enjoys advanced technology, digital connection, and high digital literacy, and the public schooling system, which is less resourced, which is often technologically underdeveloped and without digital connection. The two schooling systems experienced the various levels of lockdown differently. Private schools were mostly able to continue with the education online, where many public schools struggled with this new normal. The 4IR is meant to address this inequality. However, the way in which it is introduced and diffused in a country as unequal as ours is very important. The introduction and proliferation of advanced digital technologies, such as those associated with the 4IR, is likely to increase inequality rather than alleviate or reduce it, unless policy interventions are specifically designed to redress unevenness in the opportunities to utilize these advanced technologies. This resultant digital inequality paradox means that as more people are connected to or become data subjects of advanced technologies, the more inequality increases. Digital inequality not only exists between those online and offline, but between those who have the technical and financial resources to use the internet optimally and those who cannot afford consistent, meaningful usage or lack basic digital literacy to use new applications and services. So we need to ask ourselves, what is required to redress digital inequality, harness the potential of new technologies for social and economic development, and improve public sector efficiency and delivery? This digital inequality paradox is arguably one of the most intricate policy problems facing governments today, particularly in high unequal countries like South Africa. The introduction of advanced technologies will amplify current inequalities unless it forms part of a transversal national project that seeks to transform the economy and society, including developing some digital preconditions. These conditions include enabling affordable access to and use of advanced technologies by all. So in many ways, inclusive innovation is argued to be one of the interventions required to ensure equitable access to 4IR benefits. However, even with such an approach to innovation, a major constraint of the implementation of the 4IR lies in the lack of prerequisite conditions, such as ICT infrastructure, skilled personnel, and inadequate regulations. Complementary policies across all areas of human endeavor are thus required to ensure that the 4IR is tenable and that it does not exacerbate inequalities, but increase social inclusion. Education, in particular, and the 4IR in South Africa, is therefore a question of social justice and historical redress, as well as economic growth and competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. You are definitely bringing in a much more current perspective towards thinking about women's participation and action in everyday lives and existence. So obviously, again, the questions, we are going to hold them through until everyone has presented. Our next presenter is Sal Muthayan, who holds a PhD and is at the National School of Government. I think you can just give us a brief introduction of yourself before you continue to share your slides and give us your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So yes, so my name is Sal Muthayan. I'm a Chief Director at the National School of Government, where I've been working for a number of years now. I come from an NGO background originally, working with rural communities in the Eastern Cape. And it's actually where I've learned a lot more than my PhD, and it's what my PhD was finally based on. So I have a passion for working with communities and with community development. And so, you know, I have a PhD from the University of British Columbia in Canada. And I think I'll proceed with my presentation before I lose my 5 minutes.
No worries, okay.
Okay. Okay, so coming to the whole idea of education, advancing education for social change, my role in the School of Government is we're constantly looking for how we can deliver education programs to public servants that will enable them to, you know, manage the transformation of government. This is what we're teaching them to do. How can you improve the lives of the people in South Africa. And that, as you can imagine, is a constant challenge. And after many years of working there and being, heading up curriculum design at the National School, it remains a challenge. So we begin everything in our design on the Constitution. We adopt a social justice approach more and more now, because we found that the public service policies, etc., were very heavily based on new management theory. And as you know, that is driven by a neoliberal theory and background. So since about 2012, we've been constantly trying to change the focus of our programs, because as you know, education does not just ordinarily bring about social change. There are many kinds of education, and education was actually the foundation and cornerstone of apartheid. And I mean, this is how we lived back then. So one needs to look at what kind of education do we need if we are going to enable social change. And that is why we work towards achieving transformational education. We're looking at how do we decolonize the curriculum, and how do we achieve change through constantly using an African lens, a decolonizing lens. So that's why you can see we use a lot of African methodology and participatory methods. The philosophy of Ubuntu comes through when we are thinking about the design of our program. So instead of using quotes of Western leaders, we strive to remember African leaders. Storytelling, as you know, this lady, she's a storyteller, Klina Shlopi. And so we use a lot of storytelling. Storytelling is actually a way for the participants that are attending our courses to co-create curriculum with us. We use African proverbs. We ask the participants to share any proverbs and cases that they know. And these are the things that we include in the program that I'm going to tell you a little more about. In fact, in one of our programs that I'm going to tell you about, we've also presented about African women in leadership. And this was one of my slides from about 2 years ago that we used. We talked about people like Cecilia Makiwane as well, and other great African women. We think that's important to speak to the audience about this, because often our education is so Western based that the kind of examples and images people have of leaders and management, when they're studying things around management and leadership, it's often images from the West. So we're very careful to make sure that we make this kind of shift, this kind of change within what we're bringing about. So our philosophy is a very simple one. It's known as know, be, do, and apply. This comes from the notion that for transformational learning to actually happen, for change to happen, one has to integrate knowledge, that's cognitive knowledge or cognitive intelligence, with emotional intelligence. You've got to integrate the head and the heart in order to be able to make a shift in your thinking and in your doing as well. So that's where the hands come in here. And then very importantly for us is the application. Public servants might know certain things, they may learn about legislation, but often you don't see the implementation in the workplace. So our emphasis more and more is on how do you apply that knowledge? And it's only when you apply that knowledge that you can see some kind of change in the workplace. So that's very, very important for us. And the idea is, when I talk about change there, the idea is that you've got to change yourself before you can change others. So self-reflection and self-transformation is the beginning before you can go on to transform the workplace or the public service as a whole. And this is actually in tandem with what Frantz Fanon says about change and about bringing about changed societies. So I want to tell you, and I'll use this 5 minutes and the next to tell you about one of our programs that we've designed and developed using that philosophy. And it's a mandatory program from Cabinet asking us to design programs on the art of facilitating socioeconomic rights. And this is one of the programs that we designed for community workers on the art of facilitating participatory community engagement. The idea was that if we, have people go through this kind of program, that they will have more skills and possibilities of uplifting the communities, the very, very poor communities they work with. And as you can see, the contents is about where are the resources in your community? How do you partner with business and government, etc., to have little projects and little programs? How do you write a funding proposal? And trauma debriefing was one of the important ones, because people who work with poor communities, they see the trauma of poverty daily. They're living in it. They're not at a nice air-conditioned office as some of us are, or sitting in homes with roofs and windows. They are right there at the cold front with these communities. So we found that the trauma debriefing session was very, very useful, and people really loved the session and asked us to actually include it in all other training as well. The thing about this program is that we didn't decide on the content ourselves. We went to the participants, and the participants started with the Retired Nurses Association in King Williamstown. Our minister actually asked us to do a program for them. One of the founding members of this association is the wife of Steve Biko, Ma Biko, Notsikelo Biko, and they then were the audience. And I met with them and asked them about their training needs. I did not go in there as the person with the PhD and that I knew it all. And actually, when I met them, I realized they had a thing or two to teach the NSG, and that was actually a mutual kind of teaching that went on there. So out of that, we decided on the whole contents and the design of the program. So they co-designed the program, and the empowerment that this brought to them, the excitement and the real transformation that could happen was there. It was because it wasn't content coming from Pretoria or from the NSG. It was a joint collaboration to co-create the program as we went along. These are some of the things that we teach in the facilitation. How do you empower people? How do you listen with respect? How can you be authentic? Sometimes when people run programs, they don't want to show they don't know something, but we talk about vulnerability. We talk about how to be authentic, how to be present. And so we also talk about how to facilitate, how not to tell, not to present, not to preach, but rather to ask. And most importantly, how to listen with respect. These are like the foundations of the approach that we use in designing and developing this program. So this is a picture of this wonderful group of ladies. They were the most amazing group that I'd ever worked with. I've been at the National School for 15 years now, but they would be in the classroom waiting when I went to set up like a half an hour before. And so I'll tell you a little more about one of the programs, what they actually did in the training that we had, which shows you, it gives you kind of example of how this transformational training or teaching or education actually works. So I'll stop there now because I see the hand is up. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that.
I'll stop sharing now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Similar to all the panelists, I'm just going to keep on sounding like a broken record. We will hold the questions until a bit later. Our next panelist is Phindile Kunene from Chisimani Center for Activist Education. A quick background on Phindile. She holds a master's In history from the Wits University, her research explored the history of the local state, youth political activism, as well as apartheid forms of co-option demobilization. She has also explored post-apartheid forms and repertoires of collective action and protest. An activist herself, she has been involved in youth and student movement, trade unions, and currently works as an educator and curriculum specialist in service to activist organizations. So Pindile, again, I will give you 5 minutes to quickly give us a presentation.
Okay, all right. Thanks. Thank you very much, Comrade Chair. So my reflection really is rooted in my experience, which is not that long, but since 2016, I've been part of this organization called Chisimani, which is based in Cape Town. And the organization describes itself as a space or a hub for activist education. And in a sense, much of what I will say today is drawn from that experience, which has involved me and comrades, colleagues, fellow activists working with diverse activists, young people, working with workers, working with different people from working class communities, largely in Cape Town, but increasingly outside of Cape Town, and people from different political persuasions, both in terms of party politics, but also in terms of the social movements that they are drawn from. And so my input, I was asked to make an input on activist education and what activist education's contribution to social change is, or what it could be. And I'm excited because in a sense, my input comes after Dr. Sal's input, which is really about some of the things that I will be touching on, although what I've been doing or what we've been doing happens in a different context, which is really the context of working with social movements in the main, whether you call them movements around housing and land, or even workers' movements, trade unions, and so on. So, but maybe let me start with the question, what is activist education, or what do we consider activist education? And this is what I'd like to focus the first part of my presentation on. So, there are three things I suppose to highlight. Firstly is about this question about the who. So who activist education is for, or who it's targeted at. Then the first thing to say really is that activist education happens with people who are politically engaged. So it's a deeply political process, but it happens with people who are invested in social change. So it's not just education for its own sake, but it's education that happens with people who are in the theater of struggle and people who are interested in changing the very circumstances that undermine various aspects of their lives. And those people could be shack dwellers, it could be workers, it could be community healthcare workers, it could be unionized workers, it could be students in student organizations, or learners in organizations like Equal Education and so on and so forth, which Nongcwele will touch on. And then the second thing is that activist education is geared towards something. I think there was a point earlier on made about how education takes place in different spaces in society. So activist education is deeply political, and it's geared at changing circumstances that are facing people at the present moment, whether it's oppression and exploitation and all of that. And there is a deep recognition that experience is very important to that process of doing activist education. The third element is, I suppose, the how. And the previous speaker actually touched quite a lot on this question of the how. So activist education is also concerned with how people learn. So what are the best ways that people learn? And what we've learned over time is that people learn first and foremost when they can see themselves as part of what is being taught, or what is being discussed in a learning space. So experience is quite important in that regard. And people also learn when the space is open to question as opposed to telling. So people learn better by doing and actively participating in the learning process, as opposed to maybe somebody standing in front and giving a lecture and so on and so forth. But what we also know is that people actively learn or learn better when the methods are participatory. And this is where I suppose things like creative methods like role plays, educational games, and so on and so forth come in. So that in a nutshell is what activist education is about, but it also engages the mind and the body, right? So this whole recognition that learning is not just from the head, from the neck upwards, but it's something that also involves your entire body. It's embodied in a sense. To go deeper into this before I run out of time, in summary, what we've been doing and what we've been learning on this journey is that you can think of activist education, I suppose, as a three-legged stool, with the first thing being that how we experience the world and what we make of our experience of this world is critically important. So this is something that other people would call social critique or analysis. But the social critique or analysis starts off from what people are experiencing. So if we look at the example of the growing movement of land occupations, let's say land occupations in Cape Town, the starting point when we look at that question from an activist education perspective is not so much to ask how that affects the city or the municipality, but to ask questions around what is the force that pushes people to the occupations? Where do most of these people come from? Why do we see an increase in occupations in this particular moment of the lockdown? And these questions might or may lead us to other deeper questions about land hunger or landlessness, questions around the slow pace of land reform, or even how the lockdown, as hard as it was, has created an opportunity because of the moratorium on evictions for people to actually find new ways of finding a home and making space for their children in a highly divided city. So that's sort of like the first thing. So how we experience the world and what we make of that experience. The second thing is about, this question about activist education being a politically engaged process, which by implication means that there's some form of resistance that happens. And out of that resistance, there are certain questions that come to the fore, and there's also learning that happens out of that resistance. So some examples of questions that might come up is how the landlessness in South Africa is, how the landless in South Africa are organizing to fight against their prevailing conditions. And as they're struggling, what are the key questions around political strategy that are emerging out of that? So who are their allies? Who are their enemies for which no reconciliation is possible? What kind of contradictions exist among these sections of the oppressed, and so on and so forth. So sort of asking some of those deep questions. The third element, I suppose, and this element is quite important because in my experience, I suppose, being a student or being a student activist, a youth activist, and participating in a number of structures is something that doesn't happen as often or that's been neglected. And this is the question really about imagination. So the recognition that it's not enough to experience exploitation and oppression, and it's not enough to just be enraged by your current circumstances or even to just fight, but it's also important to see and to start thinking about what the world looks like beyond this moment, the terrible moment that one finds themselves in. And so activist education also allows us to imagine possibilities beyond what exists today. And this is critically important because, I mean, there are two things that I'm thinking about here, but the first thing is that there are different ways in which exploitation and oppression actually conscripts our imagination or locks us into a space where we can't imagine life beyond the present or the present misery. And so it's important to hammer this point in about imagination. I think somebody says actually that capitalism doesn't only survive by repressing and oppressing workers in factories, in mines, on the farms and so on, but it also does so by keeping us away from imagining possibilities or conscripting our imagination. So that's quite important. And then, I mean, there are other reasons why imagination, I suppose, is important. Robin Kelly usually says that we know what today's activists are fighting against, but what are they dreaming about? So the kind of world that we're sort of dreaming about is important. And as I conclude, I mean, in the left itself, or sections of the left historically, have looked at this question of imagination as utopian, and often dismissed it as unscientific, or dismissed it as something that doesn't really have any value for our struggles today. But we know that for people to remain in struggle and for people to keep on fighting, there must be that something that inspires them, that another world is possible, and it's actually possible to get over the present misery that one finds themselves in today. And I suppose different generations of struggle have sort of always had that even if we are beaten today, or we're exploited and we suffer all these miseries, but there's another world that actually lies beyond the wreckage that is today. So my input will stop here for now. When I come back for part 2, I'd like to talk about what we get wrong when we do activist education and some of the mistakes that we make in this journey. Yeah, but I'll stop there for now.
All right, thank you so much. We are definitely going to be looking forward to your next contribution, as you have stated. Our next panelist is Nobungcwele Mbem, who is the General Secretary of Equal Education, and I'd just like her to quickly introduce herself to everyone else. Thanks. And 5 minutes will start soon.
Okay, thanks so much. Hello to everyone. I am just that. I'm here in my capacity as the General Secretary of Equal Education. And it's great to have comrades in the room as well. So I'm just less nervous about my own input. So we're talking about e-education as a sort of tool for social transformation or social change. And I thought to reflect in 2 ways with people. The first is that I want to draw a picture around how equal education was born 69 years later after Maxeke had passed. But the need for a social movement that was led and centered young people in the country for education and racial justice was still quite pertinent. And so this is the reason that we exist. I've shared a link with people to just our Twitter page, because I think that's the most busiest, for Abantu to just follow our work and meet our members and the voices that we represent on that platform, so that I don't go through all of that now. But in 2014, it was known that plus 52% of learners do not make it through the schooling system. This is in basic education. Grade 4s, 78% of learners in the 4th grade cannot read for meaning in South Africa. 20% of grade 6 learners cannot write or do or practice maths at the appropriate grade level. And when you begin to break this down by sort of social strata, 65% of 6th graders in Model C schools, previously white schools, are able to practice maths at appropriate scores. In XDT schools, less than 0.1% of 6th graders are able to perform or practice maths at appropriate scores. Most recently, so an infrastructure report from the Department of Basic Education showed at the end of last year that there are still over 2,700 odd schools with only plain pit latrines as a source of sanitation. We still also have over 173 schools without any electricity inside of those school communities. Now, this is the reality that makes it important for formations and movements like Equal Education to exist. And so when we speak about social transformation, we must also think about input Dekapindi and this idea of houselessness and inequality. By Usal as well, talking about the deep inequalities, structural, socioeconomic, political, inside of our country. And all of these things have a ripple effect inside the traditional sense of our school communities in the country. But because we come from a social movement, we don't only grapple with these issues by thinking about what happens inside of the classroom, or what kind of infrastructural needs learners and teachers have, but also the psychosocial impact this has on young people in this country and on learners in particular. And so when we reflect on the times of, this is sort of my second bit of the input, sort of painted the picture. When we reflect on the times, there are three things that come to mind. The one is sort of the bravery and imagination. When I was speaking to Sarah in preparation for today, she called Mama a woman of many firsts. And we can only imagine being able to advocate, struggle, call others to, for something that you have never seen or experienced yourself. It requires an immense amount of bravery. And this is something, an ideal and a principle and a politics that equal education also carries in its members. We are fighting for a just and equal and quality decolonized education system that we've never been part of. And so we continue to struggle and hope, what Tupindi was saying, that the future will look different and we can all be part of it. The second is around imagination, also not daring to just stick inside of the reforms. So it is not going to be enough for us to know that we have over 60% of learners in the next 2021 passing matric or making it through the schooling system, for example. That will be insufficient. It won't be enough that we fully eradicate plate latrines in schools by the end of 2021. We need to think about education, the school community, the flourishment, emancipation, safety, and education justice of young Black people in this country as something far more than these kinds of sort of characteristics. That is just the one thing that we gain from our relationship with legacy. The second is around organizing. Now, I don't need to tell people up in Dobana, if you've got a vision and you want to achieve something that is important both at a local level, but also structurally, you need to bring others on board with you. And so this is the work that we do inside of this movement, and that we draw from the legacy of Umam, is that it is important for us to organize those that think like you, first of all. So to encourage our learner members to go into their school communities and find other learners and ask them about what issues hinder their ability for a conducive and safe teaching and learning environment, and for them to build sustained and localized campaigns around those issues, for them to entirely lead and run those campaigns by themselves. And when we learn, those campaigns have a regional reach. So schools in Khayelitsha, Delft, Nyanga, Mfuleni, close to in proximity to one another, all share issues around textbook shortages and inadequate sanitation. We're able to then deal with that kind of issue and those concerns of learners at a structural level as a provincial campaign that's able to be supported by the infrastructure, equal education, that's obviously also been built over many years. And with that also comes a very hard lesson. It's something that we struggle with as young activists today, as the idea of bringing on board people that also do not necessarily support or see your vision or experience it firsthand. So do you invest time in making sure that those that are on the outskirts of these issues maybe enjoy slightly more privileges or think their issues are so more important than yours? Do you leave those people out? And ours is to try and orientate ourselves or organize in a very intersectional nature. The idea that what happens inside the school is in fact an issue of the school community and vice versa. And so we work with comrades that are fighting for land justice in the inner cities of Cape Town to talk about the experience of learners that travel out of the Khayelitsha into the City Ball area of Cape Town to go and learn. The dissonance, cognitive dissonance that plays in their lives, and what access to quality education requires from Black youth in this country. To organize, that's the second. The third is that interventions also sort of sought to localize some of the impacts that she wanted to make, but they were for structural reform and evolutions or overhauls on the whole, and that's why we can celebrate her in Namhlanje. So it is important, like Upindi says, to celebrate the small gains. So when we are able to, and Itumelang's on this call, maybe able to reflect on this later, have a school build toilets finally after 4 years of advocacy in a very rural part of the Eastern Cape, it means that learner members of equal education in the Eastern Cape understand that youth and in fact people's power is something that can still give us gains in this period. I don't know how long I've been speaking, but I see your cameras on. But I mean, I imagine I'll be able to come back. Two things I want to put on the table, that when I think about education, I'm not necessarily talking about the traditional sense, where you go into school and you learn of your ABCs, although that is an immediately realizable right in the democratic country, South Africa. And so we must fight for the fruits of democracy so that the learners here are able to learn in schools that at least have electricity and libraries and labs, not as a luxury, but rather as a necessity. But what I'm orientating towards is the need for us to think about a people's education that is youth-led and youth-centered. This kind of knowledge is essential to developing a citizenry that's able to sort of go out into the world and meet their fullest potential in whatever sort of interests that they hold. And then I want to talk about how do we tip the scale so that when we do think about education for social transformation, we aren't thinking about the goods of inside the classroom, but rather how education in fact gives people a sense of self, which then informs building a vibrant democracy, if that is the thing that we are working towards in the future. I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you so much for that. And I think if there's other aspects that you have left out, you are more than welcome to share them in the next session or the next round. Our next panelist is Lesego, who is a student activist, Black feminist, and an aspirant social entrepreneur. She's a political studies and sociology graduate from Wits University and is currently completing her PDM at Wits Business School, where she is specializing in public peace and security studies. Lesego has led in the Wits Social Sciences Student Council as the chairperson in 2019 and 2020, and as a deputy secretary in 2018. She is also the former deputy chairperson and acting chairperson of the Wits SASCO branch in 2018 and 2019. She's passionate and dedicated to servitude and believes that at the core of her purpose is the need to play a role in bettering the material and social conditions of those most marginal and vulnerable in society. So thank you so much, Lesego. I'll just give you your 5 minutes starting now.
Thank you so much. I'm just struggling to switch my video on. Can I just be given 2 seconds to sort that out? Yes. Okay.
No worries. I'll pause the counting for now. Don't worry.
Thank you so much. Okay. I need to go into settings. Two more seconds, sorry.
Okay, no worries. Perhaps while we just wait for you to quickly get the settings correct for the video, I just want to say that we are going to be having, oh, let me just switch on mine. We are going to be having another round with the panelists. And then after that, we are going to be opening a questions time. Again, I say that you are welcome to insert your questions in the chat as they come, or you are welcome to later on raise your hands and address your questions to the specific panelists. So that is going to be the structure of the webinar as soon as the panelists are done and we move into the second round of contributions. yeah, so second round of contributions first, and then we're going to open it to the floor for Q&A. And on the floor, you are welcome to switch on your videos when you do answer your questions, but we would like to request that you keep your mics and videos off if you do not want to, or if you're not answering the question or asking the question as yet. And for those who have some technological struggles or challenges, you are also welcome to include your questions in the chat area, and I will gladly either read them out for you on your behalf, or you can read them yourself. So I think Lesego has rejoined us, and we are just going to quickly, hey, I can see you now. So your 5 minutes starts now.
Thank you so much. I have been asked to speak to the role that institutions of higher learning play in the facilitation of social inclusion and social change. I almost said mine is going to be very short, comrades, but then I realized that I'd be exposing how much time I spend with comrades. But I'm just going to get into it since I have 5 minutes. Higher education as a prospect, and subsequently institutions of higher learning, are key contributors to social equity, intellectual reproduction, social, political, cultural, and economic development, as well as contribute towards shaping conceptions of democracy and social justice, among other conceptions. Institutions of higher learning are potentially key role players in fostering social cohesion, especially where the most vulnerable, marginalized, and disadvantaged class, racial, and gendered groups are concerned. These institutions may serve as catalysts of social change and inclusion by providing the aforementioned groups the necessary social and economic advancements, not only to better their material conditions, but also to shape adequate redress and promote somewhat of a positive perception of difference, especially in a society as unequal and as racist as that of South Africa. Social change may evolve from a multiplicity of sources, which was embodied by the revolutionary life lived by Ume Charlotte Makhomo Manye Maxeke. Her life reflects the importance of education, not only for self-development, but equally for the social, cultural, political, intellectual, and even economic development of others. Her role as a churchgoer, a choir member, a student, a theorist, an intellectual, and an activist, a feminist, a teacher, resulted in vast social change and inclusion of those who existed in those spaces. Ume Maxeke's involvement and establishment of fundamental societies, institutes, and organizations that cultivated knowledge production, such as the Wilberforce Institute, the South African Native National Congress, or the Bantu Women's League, and her overall contribution to the liberation movement of this country can all sort of be linked to her pursuit for education and belief of education as the only route to a prosperous and fulfilled life for the Africans of South Africa. Social change at its core, right, requires rapid transformation of the status quo, meaning changes in human interaction, cultural norms, societal institutions, and relationships. The transformation, although it takes place over a period of time, has long-lasting effects and consequences for society. Social movements that have yielded women's rights, the right to vote, and LGBTQIA+ rights are all reflective of the impact the pursuit for social change has when collective resistance and power are at the forefront. However, in speaking about the mannerisms in which institutions of higher learning have facilitated social change and inclusion, we cannot be utopian or merely theoretical about that role. It would be disingenuous of me to deny the relative access that has been afforded to historically marginalized class, racial, and gendered groups in the post-apartheid epoch. But it is essential to highlight that this access has been limited, and where it has been realized, it has reflected low retention rates and demographically skewed success rates where those marginalized groups are concerned. This echoes how these institutions do not adequately epitomize their role as agents of social change, meaning their facilitation or facilitative role remains largely unrealized, where institutions of higher learning instead serve as a powerful mechanism of social exclusion and injustice through both their internal thinking, structures, cultures, practices, and their external relations with wider society. The demand for decolonialism, for example, of university curricula during the 2015-2016 Fees Must Fall movement is a direct mechanism which responds to the attainment of social change where theorization and academic thought production are pertained. Since then, there has been a plethora of literature produced on this demand and a number of responses from some of the universities. Although the higher education sector has held numerous summits seeking to respond and implement this demand, and some universities have appointed several committees in hopes to transform the curriculum, various scholars accuse them of decolonial washing. And so what this suggests is that the universities are giving the impression that their curricula are decolonized, although this might not actually be the case. Whether this is true or not is up for debate, but we must be clear that in order to achieve adequate social change, by using the curriculum as an example, as a tool, decolonialism would need to be approached with the necessary vigor and willingness and effort it deserves, and not as a quick fix process. I think I've used my 5 minutes, but I'll have more contribution in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Of course, you will be given another opportunity to contribute in the second round. So now we have got Sibongile Ndashe from the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa. She's the founder and executive director of the Initiative for Strategic Litigation Africa, which is ISLA. She's a feminist who has worked as a public interest lawyer for the past 20 years. Her work focuses on litigating gender and sexuality before the African human rights systems and supporting litigation before national courts. She also designs capacity strengthening programs in order to develop a pool of African feminist lawyers who can litigate on women's rights issues, and other lawyers who can provide quality legal representations to people who face violations because of their sexuality. Sibongile, I'm going to give it over to you for your own 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I am going to talk about the work that I do. We say we do litigation for social change. And in order to be able to do litigation for social change, we need to be able to do what we call legal empowerment, because we do believe that we need to have empowered constituencies as a role player in the litigation process, so that not all the powers are given to the lawyers in the courts. In South Africa, I'll travel a bit. I'll start in South Africa and then just talk about the other work we do. Whatever our feelings are about the Constitution and its origins, it is the tool that has been given to us to undo the deeply embedded patterns of inequality that continue to make its presence known. Despite what we know and what we see about the constitutional project, South Africa continues to believe in the rule of law, The Constitutional Court remains a trusted institution. State violence and the breakdown of the criminal justice system does not often come with calls to defund the police. Instead, more police and more police training is what we hear. So in order to make the Constitution work for us, as citizens, we need to stop outsourcing this work to lawyers and the courts. Lawyers cannot be the only interlocutors of the Constitution, and the courts cannot be the only site of resistance when things have gone wrong. An engaged citizenry is one of the things that is going to make the constitutional project work. So when we talk about this engaged citizenry, we're talking about legal empowerment. Legal empowerment is the process through which poor or marginalized people become protected and are enabled to use the law to advance their rights and their interest in relation to the state and the market. In many instances, we have seen legal empowerment being a component of civic education, and I think other speakers before me have really said quite a bit about organizing, about this kind of civic education, so that people actually better understand what it is that they are trying to change in society and the kind of work that goes into that. Legal empowerment helps us to understand what we are entitled to. So when we engage the state as right holders, and we see the state as duty bearers, something begins to change, because we are not only waiting for handouts from the state, we know what we are entitled to and what the Constitution gives to us. And we have seen this time and time again. The people who have benefited or continue to benefit from the Constitutional Court and from the other court decisions. Right now, I think political issues have sort of taken the day, and so that tells you where the power is. But in issues that we commonly work with and kind of that affect people on a day-to-day basis, most of these cases have been cases that have gone to court with their support of public interest litigation organizations that have got the expertise to look at various sections of the Constitution. But this has changed a bit as funding becomes a problem and a number of organizations having to shut down. So access to courts has become a problem. So what is it that we can do as citizens? What's the kind of education that we need to enable us not to let the courts be the last line of defense because we have allowed other systems not to work? We have gone through a process where Parliament failed to exercise oversight, where the executive failed to do what it was supposed to do. And for a very long time, we saw the Constitutional Court being that last line of defense. So what I would like to talk about is about how social movements can begin to think about litigation and begin to develop this engaged or empowered kind of citizenry that we want to be able to see, that's able to engage with the law broadly, but also with the Constitution in particular. What we have always known is that there are often different roles that we play in advocacy. And we know that there are different forms of advocacy tools that are available to us, and that these have their place in our advocacy. So at any given point, there will be a diverse set of advocacy tools that are available at our disposal. But when we are legally empowered, that is when we will know what is the appropriate tool, to use at which time. Whether it starts with the protest, we have to know what it is that we are demanding. whether it's a letter where we are collecting signatures in order to be heard, so that the letter serves as appropriate pushback when something has gone wrong, we would need to be legally empowered to be able to continue to engage with that. The other thing is also about role clarification, because as citizens, we would know what we need to know, but we also need to begin to challenge the powers that we have given lawyers in our lives. South Africa has got what we call a split bar system, where we've got attorneys and advocates. And it is important that we begin investing in what we're calling kind of movement lawyers who are embedded in the communities, who can be more effective as community organizers than when they are lawyers that are detached from the communities that they are working with. This is the kind of legal empowerment that we need to be able to make those decisions about the kind of lawyers that we even want to represent us, if we want to be able to do litigation that actually brings about social change. Please help me. I think I'm losing track of time. What do I have left? So the question here is, why would a social movement litigate? Why is it important for us to actually see ourselves as actors in this process? As we organize, or as we try to change various things in our communities, in our schools, in our churches, one of the most important things is that what litigation helps us to understand is that it raises the expectation of what is doable within the movement. It can also help to spark indignation and hope. It stimulates a rights consciousness amongst the constituents. Legal framing legitimizes the movement's agenda by translating a movement's interest into the language of rights. Legal institutions have the capacity to hold actors accountable and provide redress for human rights violations, creates issues around which to further organize a movement, or provides leverage in informal negotiations. These are some of the things that we would need to know in order to be able to have a legally empowered constituent that is able to fight the various forms of injustice that we continue to face. We know that sometimes litigation is glamorized, and based on what we see on TV these days, since they started allowing cameras into court. So we know that they are pros, but it is also important to know that they are cons. And this is what legal empowerment is about, so that when things go wrong, we actually know that even before things have gone wrong, that these are the things that we need to preempt. And so again, that's the role of legal empowerment.
You have gone a little bit over 5 minutes.
Okay, that's correct. That's what I was asking for. So let me stop here and then come back with the other questions.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So thank you to the panelists for all of your contributions and insights. I think one of the things that I particularly appreciate about everything that has been shared for this specific webinar is the fact that it didn't take that turn of almost creating a vacuum approach of women's participations or women's work in society. So generally, when you have a female figure who has contributed across multiple societal levels, there always has been a very generalized way in which women get put in the corner there to speak about women issues. So I really do appreciate that all of our panelists have actually borrowed certain works, certain principles, and certain lessons from Charlotte Maxeke and actually applied them in their own context, into their own environments, and how these unfold in everyday living and everyday existence of various institutions and the lives of our people. So I will start with the question. I would really like for our panelists to observe 3 minutes this time. very typical of webinar fashion is that we are running out of time, and we would like to give the Q&A session. We would like to have an opportunity to have that as well. So I'm just going to start off with questions, but please be mindful that I will have to interject and cut you after 3 minutes so that we can get our the people on the floor to actually also contribute and ask questions. So the first one is for Upindile Kunene. You mentioned something about the importance of imagination, particularly in activist education and activist work. And I just wanted to find out, how do you think that imagination can actually even be something that can be considered by people who are coming from certain groups? So for example, we have a large inequality in South Africa, and we know that those who are marginalized are currently finding themselves unemployed. So how do you think that this group can utilize some of the tools from that are used in the activist school to think beyond the circumstances which they find themselves in, which can sometimes tend to preoccupy their everyday interactions and engagement with space?
Do I have to take that now? Okay.
Oh, yes, yes. I'll just,
okay.
I think this one
All
is
right.
going to be a little bit more flexible.
Okay, so I mean, I think it's a fantastic question, right? I think it's a fantastic question, and it touches on something that I suppose I said earlier on when I quoted Max Haven, when he talks about how sort of capitalism conscripts our imagination. And this point about, I mean, people who are oppressed, who are exploited, are sometimes understandably very caught up in the present moment, whether fighting to stay in their home, fighting against eviction, or fighting to basically keep their kids in school, or to keep healthy, or for the next meal and all of that. And there might not be space in their everyday lives to sort of imagine life beyond the present circumstances. But I think that's where social movements come in. You see, the answer is not just activist education, but belonging to a movement and being politically engaged with people in similar circumstances provides some room not only to see that actually I'm not the only one experiencing this problem, or that my problems are actually deeply political, which is a feminist, something that feminism teaches us, that our experiences are deeply political. It does that, but it also allows us to identify the patterns in our oppression, that actually there are there's more than one person experiencing this thing. So this is a broader societal problem, and social movements also help us to put our heads together to sort of try and tackle some of these questions. I think many people who have been involved in movements of whatever kind, and maybe Nonqedo could also reflect on this, would know that we are inspired mostly not just by the recounting of statistics about how we are oppressed or how we don't get quality education, the numbers and all of that, but people's stories and experiences, and that hope that tomorrow another day is possible, I mean, or another future, another world is possible, gives us the space. So I would say that social movements, or being politically engaged, that is belonging to something that is more than just me, is important, is an important space. It's an incubator of imagination and asking these questions.
Okay, yeah, you were quite on the mark with 3 minutes. I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to add, perhaps because earlier you did want to mention something about limitations for your curriculum. I think I can have a minute for that.
Okay, so I mean, this is probably not going to take me a minute, but let me try. So I mean, I wanted to talk about some of the mistakes we make in this work or in activist education. And so, but I'll be very brief. I thought I could tell this by sort of recounting 3 stories, but I won't be able to do that. Maybe let me just say, I mean, the first thing I suppose, and I think this is a growing trend that we see today is the tendency, I guess, to dismiss or discount the importance of theory. So increasingly people will say, no man, don't tell us about theory and all these big concepts. Let's talk about experience and our practical, what we are experiencing now. I suppose this is a pushback against the type of education that was very heavily theoretical, that doesn't connect with people's experiences. But I think, I mean, there's a danger there by just emphasizing experience. There's something that we are losing. So experience alone is not enough, because I mean, experience is more than just the people in the room. There's experiences of, if you're a worker in South Africa, there's experiences of workers elsewhere, and they might be going through the same thing. There's experiences of workers historically who might have come across the questions that you're dealing with, but also, I mean, the world that we're dealing with today, or the forces that oppress us, are incredibly complex. And so experience alone will not be enough to get us to understand the forces behind our exploitation and our marginalization and oppression. The second thing, very quickly, is that we come from spaces where in political education, there's only really just one way of looking at the world. So the absence of plurality. And what that has done over the years, I suppose, is to give rise to dogma or doctrinaire type of political education, or some form of an echo chamber where we don't hear other perspectives from people within the progressive bloc. And I think it's quite important that when we do activist education or political education, we always ask the question, what are the debates on this question? So when we do education on the public sector wage bill, we're not only just listening to what the unions are saying, but we're also looking, okay, let's look at the balance sheet of the country. What is the state saying? What are the counter arguments and all of that? The third thing is the assumption, the dangerous assumption that political education or activist education is the magic wand that can resolve all our problems in society. That's problematic in the sense that education happens in different spaces. So a workshop or a political school will not resolve some of the crises that we're facing, whether it's on conspicuous consumption or corruption and all of that. And I like to use this example about how you find very patriarchal and backward activists, men activists who come to spaces where it's a workshop on feminism and patriarchy. They come into those spaces, they appropriate the language, they learn the concepts, and then they utilize them in ways that are very dangerous, or utilize them in ways that don't show a real shift in terms of their activism and how they conduct themselves. So activist education is not the answer to all our problems. It's important, but yeah, there are other things as well that are important in changing society. It just won't work on its own. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. So, I mean, obviously borrowing from the context or the comment that you've made about experience, Nongcedo, can I please come to you and just ask this question? So we are seeing that obviously equal education is advocating for access, particularly at the basic level, basic education level, for many individuals across different boards, particularly those who are from poorer communities. And I just wanted to find out that how do you think that this access to education actually can catalyze social change, considering that you have so many individuals who get educated, who matriculate, and you also have so many individuals who become graduates who are unable, if I can use that word, to kind of utilize the tools that are given for education to push themselves beyond the environments or beyond the circumstances or even the social kind of economic positions they find themselves in.
Yeah, I imagine we could have given a very different response maybe 6 years ago and said, indeed, you know, it does take you places. I went through my basic education system on a lot of sort of fee exemptions. And I'm able to sort of sit where I am today. But what happened at the very beginning of this year in tertiary and in basic education is case in points that not a lot of those that make it through the basic education schooling system do in fact make it to tertiary. And from tertiary do in fact find themselves inside sort of the labor market, which is what the outcomes-based system education, the outcomes-based education system wants us to believe, right? The neoliberal agenda that we are going to go through school, churn out results, assuming that we've got the same resources to give us the opportunity to engage the education system in the same ways. And then we will flourish and take our families out of poverty traps and become this new generation of enlightened and wealthy Black folk. But that isn't the reality of the majority. And so that's why I wanted to propose that when we think about education as a social transformation tool, we tip the scales in that kind of understanding. And it isn't just traditional education that is going to empower and it truly emancipates our country and young people and Black youth in particular, but it is the ideals of people's education. And Dupin herself spoke about the concept around that.
Nongcedo, I think we lost you there. a bit. Is there anyone else? Tara, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. I think we
right.
lost Nonwedo.
Okay, so it's Nonwedo that we lost. Okay, I think I will give Nonwedo another opportunity to come back and address us. Sarah, can you please quickly just get into contact with her? And then I think, Lesego, since I think Nonwedo was still kind of alluding to the point, you are a student leader based in an institution of higher learning, and then you mention all of these different marginalizations and different inequalities that kind of unfold and play out within this space. And so how do you now think that education itself as a tool can actually be seen as social change when goalposts are constantly shifting, particularly for young people who keep on getting absorbed within these particular systems, or who choose to follow the traditional way of education as the key to success? So what are your comments about about a student, as a student leader who is existing in that particular environment and who observes the challenges faced by potential graduates?
Thank you for that question. I think I want to start off by responding that the importance of education is not lessened by the inavailability of opportunities once you've attained that education, right? So I think that sort of answers the question in part, because there's this illusion that just because you're not able to get XYZ opportunities through education as we had envisioned before, you then should not get that education. And I think that also in large links to the question of decoloniality and what it is we're trying to get from education. I think when Fees Must Fall activists at the time suggested the decolonization of education, they were responding to even the issue of the importance of education and how we can redirect our views of why education is important in the first place, because decoloniality then comes with who you're being taught by, what type of content you are consuming. So who is writing the content? From what perspective is that content being written? Is it Eurocentric? Is it Africanized? You know, I think we can still get a lot from pursuing an education in terms of that, but I also understand, I don't want to be naive to the realities of many of us Black students as to why we come into this space. It's not necessarily for luxury, but it is for that particular goal that you spoke about, as education being the key to success. So that is a very, it's a difficult one to answer, because unfortunately I too am victim to that very system that seeks to, it seeks to reject me at all corners of it. So I wouldn't really know how to answer that question. I think it goes back to how one of the speakers was saying, we need to imagine a world that we have not seen. And unfortunately, we have not seen a 0% unemployment rate. We have not seen all of these utopian ideas that exist in our heads as student activists, you know, when we think about what would be the perfect scenario. But decoloniality is a large part of that.
Thank you so much, Lesego. And then now I'm going to move on to Sal. So taking on or borrowing from what Lesego has just now mentioned about decolonization and curriculum, you mentioned through your presentation the importance of curriculum consideration for transformation or towards transformation. And I think I found it especially interesting to see at the end of your presentation the group, that the picture of the group and how it was women who were part of this particular program. So I mean, my interest is just to find out, are there specific compulsory modules or courses that form part of this curriculum that centralizes women, that centralizes women and their work and contribution, because whether or not we like it, our education or the way literature is structured is still patriarchal, still centralized, or still prioritizes the male in a certain way. So I just wanted to kind of maybe find out if there's ways in which perhaps as you are thinking through this transformative curriculum, that there's a deliberate way of forcing those who are uninterested in women's work, women's contributions, into learning about women.
Yes, all our curriculum, all our programs, actually, we adopt we look at diversity, and it's integrated into the way we design the program. So you've got to be thinking about, so are we sort of shining the light on disabled people, on the gender issue, on race, and so we look for it's part of the curriculum design that there's integration, that there's attention to diversity issues. We've also now just completed designing an online course called Anti-Discrimination for the Public Sector. And that deals with discrimination in particular. And we have a number of gender programs that have been very successful for the past 15 years. We've actually been pioneers in talking about gender mainstreaming. Gender-based violence recently has been a virtual course that many departments have attended. So certainly women, women and women's issues, when we put together our master classes, for instance, we're ensuring that we have women presenters, that women feature prominently. And I think that is very important. And with the group that I was working with, I'm so pleased, and I just want to acknowledge that the president of this nursing association is actually in attendance. She's a retired teacher. It's Nontembiso Nyakana. And, she's using this virtual method of attending a conference. And I just sent her the link this morning and I said, I'm going to be talking about you ladies. Is that okay? So this is also another thing, decolonizing. This material, this course is owned by the National School of Government. It's our IP. But when you're doing this kind of work, it's very important to be sensitive to where the knowledge is coming from. And for me, the knowledge has come from these ladies, from these community workers that we worked with. And so I, on my own, sent them a message this morning, because Sarah will tell you, I only came to this very late yesterday. And I quickly sent them a message and said, is it okay if I talk about our project? And many people say there's no need to do that, but that's the kind of respect. And that's when you're thinking participatory, decolonizing, recognizing people's knowledge and affirming people where they are. You're empowering people. It's believing that people already have the knowledge. It's not just PhDs or masters and people in universities that have knowledge, or students, university students. These people that work in the communities, they know about their problems and they know about their solutions. And there's no ways you can go from outside, even if this is your PhD on this topic, you don't know as much as they know. And it's very important to be sensitive to that and to operate in that way. I just wanted to show you, because I did it here to my time earlier, but one of the things we did on this program was how to raise funds, fundraising. So I want to show you how this is very participatory and how their knowledge comes to the fore. We provided the template and we talked about how you write a proposal. But here you can see these ladies got together in a group and they wrote their own proposal. This is not me or anybody from the National School. They wrote this and they went onto computers and we encouraged them. We even gave them support. And then they wrote this whole proposal, and it's very short, but it tells you what kind of what they're requesting. But most importantly, this was the first time they actually did a budget. And you can see they're even looking at how many paint brushes they need, how much sandpaper. So the detail in the budget, which up till this stage, they'd never budgeted for the kind of projects that they had to this degree. And it was only after this program that they felt so empowered about raising funds, and also their understanding of what really goes into a proposal and a budget. But they put this together themselves. And so they were empowered, and they actually reported back at a later session that they'd raised more funds since the first the courses in 2 sessions, and in 3 months they reported they raised more funds. And I said, are you sure it's not just a coincidence? No, they were certain it was the capacity building from this program that enabled this for them. So so this is these are some of the things that they talk about, and the main thing is transformative learning should empower people. And this is what they had, the resources, they were already doing this work, but we just gave them the confidence to believe that what they are doing, they're on the right path, give them a few more skills, jointly learning together, sharing with peers. Peer learning is the essence of this kind of education. You learn from others who are doing the same thing. So that's a principal part of what we are doing. And so for me, this has been a very, very exciting program. This is actually at a venue in Ginsberg, which is a very impoverished community in the Eastern Cape. Those of you who know the Eastern Cape. But this is the Steve Biko Foundation Center. And so we were actually conducting our training in the center, but within the midst of where the poverty is and where those conditions and where those communities are. And, that's why I showed you the earlier picture was there's also a library at the Steve Biko Center, and the National School of Government went on a whole project to gather books, collect books to donate because they were short of books. And I thought I'd say this because, you being the book Stokvel, I thought, the interest in books would be there as well. So I think that's it. So thank you very much for allowing me to share. And it's really been a privilege to present here with all you amazing presenters that have been here, and so young and so erudite and so powerful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for those kind and empowering words to the fellow participants. And I think you touched on something that I think can lead us to for Phoebe's contribution now on utilizing this program as a means of emancipation, if I can say that. So Phoebe had, in her presentation, said that Charlotte Maxeke herself can be understood as something, as an individual that kind of viewed education as an emancipation tool. And then I think my question then to you, Phoebe, is what about other women within these communities? So whereas we've got a powerful woman such as Charlotte Maxeke, who we can now trace in certain ways, what about other women who sometimes get marginalized from some of these discussions? How do we then find ways of inserting them without necessarily taking away from those who we know? Because I think what sparked this particular question was that you mentioned that when she was now turning 100, because of the apartheid context and stuff, we couldn't necessarily celebrate her in a specific way. And I think that for me just kind of raised that question of, then what about those other women who have been written out of history and may not necessarily have had the position that Charlotte held, yet they contributed or had an impact within their communities in certain ways?
I think that's thank you very much, and I really enjoyed the inputs from the fellow panelists. I think that the issue about writing women back into history is an ongoing project. Women have been written out of history for, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of years. So we have a lot of catch up to do. And I think that this is one of the elements of the feminist movement that, and the women's movement, to look at how do you then focus on women. There are lots of women that were part of Maxeke's generation. we need to encourage our historians to write about them in the same way that there are still elements of her life that needs to be brought to the fore, that needs a bit more detailed. For example, her role as, during the time that she was in the Bantu Women's League, she focused on organizing domestic workers and farm workers. And this was like late, 1920s, etc. So I think that you're absolutely right. We will have to continue to do that. One of the things that struck me is, for example, when people talk about Mam Lillian Ngoyi, all historical account talks about the fact about what a powerful orator she was. But there's not a single speech that survived. Like if you go and search for a speech of hers that she's done, and even despite the fact that people draw attention to this characteristic of her, that how eloquent she was and militant and a real orator, but you don't find any of her speeches. And this is part of what we need to do. In any social movements that we're talking about, I think that we look at the role of individuals. And at the occasion, I think of the 50th anniversary of the Women's March, the Mail and Guardian did this project where they looked at, had portraits of the stories of about 156 of the women that went to the Union buildings in 1956. And there were lots of people that I didn't know about. But at the end of the day, this is just 156 out of 30,000 women that went. Where are the stories of those 30,000? So we need to continue to tell those stories. And I think that it's important as feminists that we do that, as historians that we do that. Just a final point about the role of education. I think that we're living in a world that's clearly not working for all of us. Whether it is as women, whether it's as young people, as workers, as the unemployed, as the LGBTQI community, etc., etc. You can go through all of it, even with regards to our environment. 22nd of April will be Earth Day, and we know the challenges that we face in terms of our environmental issues, in addition to the human issues that we face. And I like what was said by, I think it's Pindi, about the need for imagination as social activists. That we must look at how do we, imagine a better world, that a better world is possible. And social change is firstly about, focusing on what can you change, having concrete gains that you make. So whether it is painting your school, or ensuring that you address bullying at school, or ensuring that you improve wages or childcare facilities, but also about the broader one of what does it mean to have a truly non-sexist society. But in addition to that, the change also happens incrementally, as well as with certain breaks. And it's recognizing the need for making sure that we build, as a movement, build that solidarity, build that consciousness, and build that commitment towards action, so that when opportunities presented to make a real qualitative change, that we have the capacity to do that as a society. And education is about building active citizens that's engaged politically, economically, socially, culturally. And that's at the end of the day what education is about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I am seeing a quick question here in my chat. I'm not going to be able to answer it. So our panelists are going to speak again, obviously, once they are answering or addressing questions from the audience. So I would like to now move to Uzama quickly for your second round. You mentioned you bring us now from the historical into the current and potentially the future by looking at the fourth industrial revolution, and how there are digital inequalities that are currently existing. And I just wanted to find out that when we are now looking at ourselves as a people or as a group that is already having certain levels or certain types of struggles in other facets of life, how do you then think that education in whatever form, formal or non-formal, can contribute towards closing the gaps of digital inequalities, or even the digital world work towards assisting in closing the inequalities that are currently existing? So Zama, I hope you're still with us.
I'm trying to check if she's still with us. She had indicated that she was having challenges with network.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so then since Zama, we're just going to be waiting on Zama, I guess, to join us. We are going to go to our final panelist, Sibongile Ndashe, who I think you mentioned something I'd never thought about before, about having an engaged citizenry when it comes to constitutional participation and advocacy. And I just wanted to find out what kind of platforms can be explored by laypersons or people that are not necessarily familiar with the legal institutions or legal frameworks, and how can these now be brought back to communities and to communities and societies which might kind of struggle with accessing the vocabulary that is used within legal environments.
Okay. There are things that have existed in some communities, and some communities have been able to retain them, but in some communities we have to rebuild this or establish them. There are organizations like NGOs that run what we call civic engagement kind of program, civic education programs, and some of the work that Chisimani does on activist education do involve some of these things, because most of the time, whether it's the equal education where Noncedo is, they organize, but there's also a law center, that's linked to that, because it's about you organizing learners, but also recognizing that there are other challenges that someone would have to kind of litigate on. So the information on rights education, I think online for people who've got access, they have Department of Justice used to have this kind of know your rights kind of booklets. But so basically it's about what it is that people need to do. Organizations like Women's Legal Center used to publish also know your rights booklets. So there was a time, but I haven't been able to kind of keep abreast of whether those are some of the things that are still happening in organizations in South Africa, because I do know that, and I did mention the kind of budget cuts, so prioritizing the kind of services that are available. But I do think that in our organizing spaces, this is one of the things that would have to make a part of our organizing, so that when we organize, we also put legal empowerment, as part of the things that we are learning, about. So it's not about what we want to have access to, but just also understanding what is the correlating, like the rights that actually helps us to support that, so that the claims or the demands are not made in abstract, but the empowerment actually say that's what enable us now to actually go and develop, the various strategies. So when I talk about the law, I'm talking about the law broadly. We may not necessarily go to court, but I think what is important is that we have the answer that says when this happens, the right has been violated, or when the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicides, for example, is not implemented as it should be, then we have the power to actually stop that, because there is something about following procedures and then being able to use that language. But it is something that would have to be part of our advocacy, so that we don't become a depoliticized organizing voices.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you to all the panelists and to everyone who is still here and who has joined us today. We highly appreciate it. I am now opening the floor to questions. So please raise your hand and I will start noting the hands as they come. Just one quick request. Can you please try to make your questions within a minute? So I know that sometimes a question can come as a form of a comment, but if we can try to be mindful of time, that would be quite helpful. So yes, I am open. The floor is open to questions. You can raise your hand if you would want me to note you. Okay, Lisa, I am probably might not pronounce your name correctly. Kwaita Wenana, I'm sorry about that. Can you just help me with pronouncing your name? I am noting you. You can now unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, no, I was saying well done. You did it perfectly. That was a perfect pronunciation. I have two questions. The first will go to the last panelist, I think Ndashe, who spoke around legal empowerment. And as an activist who is politically engaged, I would like to believe that, like, even our law center, so I come from an equal education space, is we are empowered to not only know as fight for them, hold governments accountable. But the issue now is when government miss or fail to meet their own legal obligations. So you have an empowered group of people, legally so, but you still have we're dealing with a government that doesn't care about its own.
Okay, I think we lost her.
Yes, it looks like we lost her.
Yeah, so I think she's gonna probably join us again, and I'm going to note her quickly. Sibongile, she had her question targeted at you, but obviously she didn't complete it. Oh, she's back.
Sorry. Yes, I was just asking how do we then move from that, knowing that, we can actually fight for policies to be laws, like the norms and standards for public school infrastructure was a policy, and then we turned it into a law through activism. And then they keep breaking or not meeting their legal obligations. And like that's like the point that we're at. And then another question to Pindi. I think the input was very useful. I don't think I've heard anyone speak about activist education in the way that she has. Quite like makes you think practically about the thing, but also like the process around it. Ben Funugutima, when she spoke about political engaged group, like you need to be politically engaged for you to have a process of like gaining education, like in terms of like activist education. But again, we have a deeply like depoliticized youth. But even though the youth that are politically engaged, they have a very conventional way of like understanding politics and the routes to power and fighting that power. So like Abantu basically are disengaged or disempowered. And it's part of the fact that like capitalism destroys our imagination. It's what you were pointing to. But like, what is the thing that we need to do? Because it's not just a problem like of the post-school youth in EE, it's in ANC politics, sports, EFF, student command. Like the youth of right now is very much, like, I don't know what's the word for it, but detached and just stagnant. And so how do we make even the politically engaged one engaged? You know what I mean?
I think I kind of understood what you meant, and I do think that she probably picked it up. So I'm just going to take a few more hands before I allow the panelists to respond. So Mpotladi, I can see in the chat that you said you are struggling to raise your hand. So can you please unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Usually when Sarah does these things, I congratulate her. She knows, so I'll congratulate her again today, and she doesn't like it. Congratulations to you as well, Holiness. Very, very wonderful engagement. Very, very insightful as well and robust. My question is directed at Comrade Pindile. And I think only Comrade Phoebe made mention of the bullying. I might have missed other comments on the bullying while I was gone. My connection. Oh no, there was a pause in the feedback. But Comrade Pindile, you said something about our experiences being deeply political. I, for one, am also a victim of bullying when I grew up from primary school level all the way to I think my varsity days. And not everyone is able to interpret or interrogate those experiences and make peace with the fact that they are politicized. So on the one hand, one person would deal with it overtly and overcompensate. On the other hand, one has a psychological experience of a mental breakdown or even committing suicide. So in terms of the recent discussion around bullying and what the current climate around bullying, what are the tools, Comrade Pindile, that you would suggest as activists in education one utilizes to address the social dynamics in interrogating the experiences of bullying, which is not only limited to schools, but also like work environments, academia, etc. Multi-sectors, actually. That would be my question to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mpho. I am not seeing any more hands, so I will just give our panelists an opportunity to quickly answer the question. So I will start with Sibongile, and then I will move on to Upindi, and I think any other panelists who would want to respond to what our two the two questions that were asked. You can, as a panelist, you can quickly raise your hand, and I will note you. So Sibongile, over to you.
Thank you for the question, Potrita. The lack of enforcement of decisions, or the kind of refusal basically to obey court orders by government, there are quite a number of interventions that have been made, and we've seen kind of innovations, that have come about in terms of how that can happen. At the point that I was making about legal empowerment, it's that we don't need to wait until such time that the issues actually go to court, because what we have noticed is how it's often too late, when we let things kind of happen at this stage. So legal empowerment sometimes is about the coming together, I think, of various strategies when we organize and when we do various things, so that we're not kind of detaching, the legal strategies or the law as something that is to be done at a later stage. So I'll make an example with the total shutdown movement. What we saw there was a coming together of various actors, people who had very good IT skills, people who were able to organize and mobilize, but also people who had kind of legal background kind of coming together, and that was part of the legal empowerment element of it. So when the 24 demands were drafted from the total shutdown, they made very clear legal demands that could be backed. And from there was a summit declaration, it's gone to the National Strategic Plan, and it's now all gone. There are the 3 pieces of domestic violence legislation that have been kind of adopted. But so when we all kind of work together, not necessarily in the courtroom situation, but basically saying what happens outside of the court is just as important as what happens inside the courtroom. And we have seen this in other movements like Me Too. Basically, the organizing sort of meets the legal strategy. And that's why mentioning that it is important to have the kind of legal empowerment, so that we have advocacy strategies that can actually take us somewhere, even if it's not to court, but actually use the law for social change.
Thank you for that, Sibongile. I think if you are done, Pindile, you can come on for the questions that were addressed to you.
Okay, so there were two questions, and I'm going to be a little bit of a tsotsi. So the first, the second question, pause question, I won't be able to answer. And so, yeah, I'm going to be a bit tricky because, yeah, I think I'll call in two. On this call, there are two comrades who are organizers in basic education with lots of experience around these questions. Bullying and so forth. So Sido, you'll forgive me. Nongcwele, you'll forgive me, but also I think Twaita, you can also come in to sort of respond to that question about what is it that we can do to change the situation around bullying and all of that. I think your experience in working with young people in schools is quite important. So I'm going to dodge that question. The second question, I think Twaita's question is quite important because it's about politics and being politically engaged. So quite for me, I think one of the problems that we have is how we define politics or what we think is political. So for a very long time, there was just this understanding of politics in a very narrow sense as party politics or belonging to a structure that it defines itself as ostensibly political, whether it's a structure of young people with student command and many other organizations that you've mentioned, or SASCO, where some of us come from, or whether it's an organization like the ANC or the EFF and so on. And we sort of limited over time the definition of politics or doing politics in those spaces. But of course, we know that once we broaden the very definition of politics or what it means to be politically engaged, then that becomes actually more inclusive. So we get to see that actually a lot of people are involved in politics and what they're doing is deeply political. So, for a long time, we thought, okay, politics is just, it's very male dominated, it's a masculine terrain, but that's because we're asking the wrong question. So quite as somebody who's like based in Cape Town, you would know when you look at the occupations and what's happening in the occupation, the idea of finding a home in a divided city is a deeply political question. And when you look at people who are actively engaged in that particular struggle, you start to see women stepping up in the forefront and actually leading and doing serious work. In the traditional definition of politics, or if you define politics with a big P, you're likely to miss the type of activism because people are not locating themselves in organized structures or in traditional organizations, so to speak. So I think there's a need to redefine what we mean by politics, and a lot of even the work that EE does, the fact that a pit latrine or the fact that there are no toilets and kids are actually falling into toilets, falling into their death. EE was able to make that a political issue. Other people would have just dismissed it as just, oh, well, it's a lobby group that is doing this, but EE has shown us how libraries are a political issue, school infrastructure is a political issue, and many other things. So I think even when we say young people are disengaged or they're not politicized, we might want to rethink that. Maybe we're using a very narrow definition of what constitutes politics. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, I think I don't see any other hands, and I will not open the floor for questions. I'm just going to allow all of our panelists to just give us a minute closing remarks as we are about to close this wonderful and very insightful webinar that has addressed the question of how can social change be effected through formal and informal educational methods. So I will go in the order that we started the session by going to Phoebe first. Can you please share with us, just your closing remarks in a quick minute?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to Sarah and the book Stokvel for a really engaging session. For me, the takeaways from this is the link between formal and informal education, that we need to focus on both. That I think the Pindile from Equal Education and other colleagues have raised the importance of addressing things like the school infrastructures, libraries, and those things are deeply political because it's about equality and access. But also the importance of informal education, because if you look at the question about bullying, people tend to bully because, for a number of reasons, one of them that they haven't been given the tools at home or wherever they're supposed to get the tools to resolve conflicts. So you resort to suppressing other people as a way of affirming yourself or as a way of getting what you want to do. So in a sense, the education system can address it formally through life skills, social sciences, etc. But at the same time, there's other places that you need to do, and that's where informal education comes in. I completely agree with the point that was being made about the importance of activism and social movements, because at the end of the day, I always say that a lot of the skills that we have, yes, you learn it in university, and the intellectual issues and learning to think and learning to write, etc., etc. But often your application and critical thinking, you learn in the social movements, because you debate issues, you test new ideas, you get exposed to new ideas. And I think that these two are both equally important for social change, your formal education system, and then on the other hand, informal education and activist education that one of the panelists spoken about. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Mpho, I just want to say that Pindile opted to be a thoughtsy about that one, so I guess you might have to engage her on a separate account. The next person we have unfortunately lost Uzama Nzima, who was our panelist that was looking at using digital kind of platforms in order to kind of advance social change through education. And I'm just going to quickly move on to Sal. Can you please quickly give us your closing remarks in a minute?
Okay, sorry, I took a bit of time there. Yes, I think just listening to everyone, it's just my main thing is that we need to constantly be aware that the education system that we have in this country, and many of us who are older, even all of us sitting here, we've been through an education system that was designed for a specific purpose. And it has colonial and apartheid portents in it. And we need to constantly re-examine, deconstruct, use a decolonizing lens and ask ourselves, where does this fit into what we're trying to achieve? And, to look also with a diversity lens, how does this affect women differently from men? How does this affect disabled people within our communities, and all kinds of difference that we encounter? So I think for me that's very, very important for us when we're looking at how do we advance social change through education. And education is not just what's happening in books and in training institutions. As I said to you, I was learning from the communities and what they were doing with practical challenges that they had and how they were overcoming that. And those are deep and very important lessons in terms of development. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then Pindile, your closing remarks, please, in a minute.
Okay, so I feel like I took up a lot of space and time. Okay. I suppose for me, this webinar was really important in just connecting the different presentations, and I do want to thank the panelists, because I think I've learned an incredibly lot from everyone, and to thank the participants who made time to attend the webinar. Thank you for inviting me. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And we also unfortunately lost Unongcedo earlier on. So Lesego, please give us your closing remarks in a quick minute.
Thank you so much. I actually want to speak as fast as I can to one of the questions. which highlighted the implications of mental health and just bullying, etc. And it was one of the things I wanted to speak about regarding social inclusion. There's a tendency to think social inclusion is just about access into the system, so into institutions of higher learning, right? But however, social inclusion in institutions of higher learning from a student-centric perspective should not be limited by just looking at it through the system or access to the system. Whilst it is important, it is only but one aspect of struggle faced by society. Once historically disadvantaged students who are predominantly Black have entered into the system, a multiplicity of other issues arise, right? And students struggle with access to learning material, with language barriers, with technological advancements, and their transition from high school to university or TVET colleges. These are the same institutions, by the way, that tell us to look to the left and look to the right at orientation week and say that most of our colleagues will not be there for graduation, which reinforces how social inclusion has been limited and, where realized, has reflected low retention rates and demographically skewed success rates, as I had mentioned before. And the result of the failure to adequately achieve social inclusion and subsequently social change also affect the safety and mental health of students, which can have a ripple effect into their ability to remain in the system and not be subject to issues such as academic exclusion, financial exclusion, severe anxiety, and even depression. I will try to end right there, but thank you so much for the opportunity. I've gained so much knowledge from my fellow panelists, and I'm also grateful for the questions that came through. I think I was very stimulated today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear that you were stimulated. And Sibongile, what are your closing remarks for us?
Is also to kind of give thanks and for everything that the book Stokvel does in order to keep these conversations going. So finally, I think we are all that we have is what where I'm going to stop. So in this context of misinformation, disinformation, our organizing and work for social change is going to require that all of us put together whatever we have in order to be able to co-create this reality that we want to be able to see, whether it's IT, whether it is legal, whether it's movement building and organizing, but we are going to have to do this social change education together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I would like to honestly give thanks to all the panelists. It has also been quite engaging on my end because we have now moved from various different topics that seep through our everyday existence. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for engaging us, and thank you to the book Stokvel for actually creating such a platform that is remembering an individual who was a leader, who was innovative in different ways during her times and during her own political activism. And as I was listening to the presentations today, I can see that a lot of these principles and a lot of this work actually has persisted and continues to persist and unfold in various ways amongst the panelists and amongst other individuals who are politically engaged in their little corners. So thank you so much to everyone. And yes, I will hand over to Sarah to just do the closing remarks before we close.
Thank you, Ngwele. I am going to start by first and foremost thanking you for facilitating tonight's conversation. It's been really great. So two of us have been trying to tweet everything that's going on, but it's so difficult because you also want to be part of the conversation. So you're not just going to be there as a person that is just going to tweet what other people are saying, but you also want to be part of the conversation and just take everything in. So thank you for facilitating that. You made it very, very seamlessly. Thank you to everyone that participated in the webinar, as well as the speakers. Thank you for affording us grace because we went beyond the time that we had communicated to you. So thank you so much for just allowing us an extra 30 minutes into your time. We really, really do appreciate it. And I just want to say that I hope this is the beginning for all of us. Like how Sibongile said, that it's, you know, in this era of miscommunication, discommunication, social injustice just becoming worse and also becoming very sophisticated, you know, because what was called racism or what was regarded to as racism or sexism 100 years ago or 50 years ago, even 30 years ago, is something that is totally different now. So all these things are becoming like oppression, subjugation, all sorts of things are becoming sophisticated in the manner in which they make people's lives difficult. So even us as a people, in resisting these things, we also equally need to devise ways in which we're going to address or eradicate or work towards alleviating whatever challenges that people are experiencing. So I really, really do hope that this conversation is just the beginning, and I hope that many people have identified areas where they're either going to start something or they're going to collaborate with other people because they already are doing something. And I would also just like to say that I'll be personally reaching out to all the speakers and see if there's anything that we can all collaborate on, because there really is so much to do. And also, as much as there's also so much to do, I don't want our work to only be about struggle. You know, there's a poem that I came across a few weeks ago, which is titled, "How Can You Write About Flowers at a Time Like This?" And it's speaking on how can Black people celebrate and want to do things that are nice and recreational and leisure when there's just also so much injustice going on. And it goes back to the initial point that I made, that our lives or our experience as Black people and also as women aren't to constantly prove our humanity to people. You know, even when we organize, even when we come together, we should also do it for things that are going to replenish ourselves, things that are going to, you know, fill in what the world already takes away from us. And I really am glad that the book Stokvel is such a collective for people that are part of us. So thank you so much to everyone for your time. And I hope you'll join us next week, Wednesday. So next week, Wednesday, we'll be having another webinar, and we're just going to focus generally on how or why upward mobility is still a challenge for women. You know how we spoke about Charlotte being a woman of many firsts, and that was like 150 years ago. Why do we still have women who are the first to do it in 2021? So thank you so much, and please have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy your evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.